So the Chequers deal, Theresa May's opening offer, we should remember, in trade talks with the European Union, is not only not going to satisfy Leave voters, it's a betrayal of what Leave voters wanted. It's a betrayal of what they voted for. Under this plan, we'd be kept in the single market for goods. Our customs partnership that she is trying to negotiate would make it impossible to do our own trade deals. You know, these are some of the central planks of what the Leave campaign was arguing for as far as taking back control. And it won't take back control, it will cede control over really important areas of our policy to Brussels, effectively, with less say over those rules than we had in the first place. So it's obvious to anyone, I think, that this is a betrayal, and you see that reflected in the almost instant response to this. The funny thing about Chequers is it's a very technical proposal. It's a massive fudge, really, and yet almost instantly, Leave voters and the public in general could see right through it. You know, YouGov did a snap poll. 40% said that they thought it was too soft a Brexit. 12% said it was too hard, and 13% said it was just right. So there's a huge amount of people who recognise that this is not what Leave voters voted for, and not what the democratic majority wanted when they voted for Brexit. And I think what it really demonstrates is the fact that we're moving into a new phase now. So after the elite failed to be able to convince us to vote Remain, after that kind of campaign of fear-mongering and blackmail didn't work, they're now having to pretend that they're following through on Brexit while ultimately just giving us a kind of Brexit in name only. And I think that we've got to see the Chequers proposal as what it is, which is effectively just a kind of feint, which is an attempt to keep us in the EU while pretending that we're not. I think one of the most exhilarating things for me about Brexit was the fact that it was a revolt, not just against the kind of forces of Remain, but really against the entire political class. You know, both of the main parties advocated for Remain, preaching fire and brimstone if we didn't stay in the European Union. And yet voters rejected that. Tory voters rejected that position. Labour voters rejected that position. As we all know, 7 out of 10 Labour constituencies voted Leave. And I think what it demonstrates for someone like me and us at Spiked, who don't support either of the political parties, frankly, is the fact that Brexit really revealed that chasm between the political class and the public, that the aspiration for more democracy, for change, for something other than the incredibly narrow kind of technocratic set of policies that both parties have been offering for a very long time was no longer satisfying people. You know, that old left-right distinction didn't really hold, and that new fault line was about effectively the elite and the people. And I think the Brexit vote showed that, and I actually think the way in which you see attitudes shifting since has really only confirmed that. I mean, only recently, Sir John Curtis, the pollster, put out this bit of analysis which found that when you actually talk to voters, about 44% of them will say that they're a very passionate either Leaver or Remainer, and only about 9% of them will say they're a passionate Conservative voter or a Labour voter. And whilst that might sound like bad news for a lot of Labour supporters, of course, a lot of people watching Labour Leave, I think it's actually something packed with possibility, because for a very long time there has been a kind of stranglehold over politics from this very narrow set of society. And one of the things that Brexit promises, aside from us leaving the EU, is being able to carve out a politics which I think reflects and shapes itself around those new fault lines in society, which I think are really about, are you in favour of more democracy, of ordinary people having a say, of more freedom in that sense, or are you against it? And I think that's the real dividing line that the party system just seems kind of incapable of actually fulfilling at this point. I think what was fascinating and also pretty appalling in the wake of the Brexit vote was the fact that a lot of these anti-democratic and frankly just anti-working class prejudices that I always assume, you know, you always think were there amongst the kind of elite ranks of society, just came completely out to the foreground. You know, if you saw the responses from certain MPs to the vote saying, quote, David Lammy, Labour MP, this madness has to stop, Parliament must step in. You know, if you saw all of the editorials arguing that effectively it was the duty of the better educated members of the political class to stop this mad populist vote from being implemented. You know, you saw certain sections of the literary set, you know, people like Ian McEwan going around just kind of fantasising about when all of these old Leave voters would eventually die off so that this kind of young, youthful Remain movement could kind of reclaim society and put us back on the pegging of common sense and the forward march of history. I mean, these are incredibly old-fashioned, almost kind of like neo-Victorian prejudices. And I think one of the things it demonstrated was that a lot of And I think one of the things that it really demonstrated was that the battle for democracy, which is really at its core a battle for making sure that ordinary people, working class people in particular, the people who have no other kind of cultural or political sway over society, that their vote, that what they think matters, that fight has never really been won. And if you actually even just to take a quick look back in history, every attempt to kind of revolt against the political class, every kind of bottom-up revolt against what the elite wants, is always greeted with these kinds of arguments. You know, if you think about the Chartist Rebellion in the 1840s, when they were delivering these petitions to Parliament signed by millions of people demanding the vote for working class men in Britain, those were denounced by MPs in Parliament in much the same terms. You know, one thing that one Whig MP, Thomas Babington Macaulay, said was that giving ordinary men the vote is giving them the liberty to destroy themselves. And you see the exact mirror of that in the way in which people argue against Brexit. They say, yes, people might have voted for this, but they didn't vote to make themselves poorer. The subtext is just a kind of more PC version of that really old-fashioned prejudice, which is to say that if you give people the vote, they're effectively going to send the country to hell in a handcart. And I think one of the things that at the very least was clarifying about Brexit was it showed that all of those prejudices, all of that contempt was very much alive and well, and Brexit was just something that brought it to the surface. I think the second referendum campaign just shows how confused actually a lot of the left are about Brexit. You know, you kind of have the centre left who, let's face it, indistinguishable from the sort of centre of the Tory party, are technocrats, are pro-European, are anti-democrats and have been lobbying for Brexit to be stopped, full stop. But then, again, you have this kind of, even amongst people who might consider themselves more radical left, on the Labour left, who the People's Vote March, they really don't know what to do with it, actually. And I think one of the things that's been really fascinating is a lot of the people on the left of politics in Britain who at least pay lip service to being in favour of working class people in the way that the left historically did, and some people still do, didn't really mean it. And a lot of the objections to the People's March, even from a certain section of people who would consider themselves radical left, is basically on the grounds that, look, we all want to stop Brexit, just this isn't the right way to go about it. The optics aren't right. It's an oddly kind of Blairite argument in a lot of sort of ways, which is our goals are the same, but you've just got to do it in a slightly different way. And one of the things that I think is most troubling, I think, for anyone who considers themselves left-wing, is that the left in this country and also across Europe has effectively lined itself up against populism and against Brexit. It's lined itself up against the expressed will not only of the majority of Britain in the case of Brexit, but also the majority of working class people in this country, the majority of people who never went to university. And I think that's something that they really need to understand. That's what they're doing. They're on the side of effectively bourgeois reaction, as we saw reflected in that People's Vote March. They're on the side of people on a march trying to overturn the biggest democratic vote in our history, waving placards saying things like, I missed bottomless brunch to be here. That's really troubling, I think, for anyone who considers themselves left-wing and progressive, because effectively that's what the left is becoming associated with. It's becoming associated with supposedly high-minded principles that they really don't agree with in practice. And I think that kind of ludicrous middle-class spasm that is the People's Vote campaign and their various marches, I think really brings a lot of that to the fore, unfortunately. So I've been against the European Union basically ever since someone actually took the time to sit down and explain to me how it worked. I mean, one of my fundamental principles politically is that I'm a Democrat. You know, I believe that the laws that govern the country should be made in this country by representatives who we, the public, can vote for and then kick out if they do things that we dislike. And on that really fundamental basis, the European Union completely undermines that very hard fought for radical idea. The European Union claims that it's in the business of just Europe kind of banding together, you know, pooling sovereignty so they can do great things. It's not about pooling sovereignty, it's about diluting democracy. It's about making that relationship between an MP and their constituent just that more indirect. It's about making huge issues, questions of spending, of immigration, of welfare, all of these sorts of things, questions which can only be slightly tinkered with by electorates and the people that they elect. It's also about what it does. If you just even had a casual glance at what the European Union has been up to, say over the course of the past 10 years, you'd recognise that it's not this wonderful, progressive, democratic project that people try to claim it is. If you think about its treatment of places like Italy, 2011, the Italian economy hits the skids, and the European Union effectively orchestrate a coup. You know, they install Mario Monti, a former European commissioner, as a life senator, and then make him prime minister, and leads a government full of technocrats. You look at their treatment of Greece during the sovereign debt crisis. You know, effectively held a gun to the head of the Greek people, made their elected representatives impose horrendous austerity measures. And when Greeks had the temerity to elect a government on a ticket of saying that they were going to renegotiate some of those measures, the line from the Commission from Jean-Claude Juncker was, elections change nothing. This is what the European Union does, and whilst I think a lot of people, particularly after the vote, have tried to make a lot of claims about why Leave voters really voted Leave, I think for the vast majority of them, it is a question of control. It is a question of democracy, and that's something which I think, and that for me, I think is the core principle about this. So populism, the P word, this has been the great kind of boo word of the last couple of years. And I think one of the things that's confusing about this is the fact that this word is bandied around, but it's never quite clear what they're talking about. You know, populist party of the right, a populist party of the left, a populist movement allegedly of Brexit. And I think what we have to remember is that when people in the elite and in the political class use the word populist, they effectively mean anything that they dislike, and particularly any movement amongst ordinary people demanding something that they don't want to give them. I think that's really what populism means. I mean, if you look at the dictionary definition of this supposedly horrendous idea of populism, it's simply a politics attuned to the concerns of ordinary people. It's about appealing to what people actually want. So when we talk about the elites being terrified of populism, constantly fear-mongering about there being this almost like neo-fascistic uprising with Brexit, with parties across Europe, we've got to understand what they're really saying. It's a code word for democracy actually being real. It's a code word for people's concerns, not just being something that politicians pay lip service to, but actually have to understand, listen to, and respond to. So I think a lot of this discussion about populism, I think, is mystifying because of the fact that I think more often than not, what the elites are, you know, spitting out their tea at is really just the question of proper democracy, ordinary people having control over politics. That's what they're scared of. I think one of the things about the Brexit vote was that it revealed not just a political divide, but also a kind of cultural divide in the country. That there was, in a sense, two Britons in many respects. Not just on the question of whether or not we should leave the EU, but on the question of how we understand society. You know, I mean, if you were to be really crude about it, you would say that on the one hand you have the kind of university-educated sets, incredibly politically correct, you know, put a huge amount of importance in, you know, a discussion about pronouns, whereas to most people that wouldn't mean very much at all. You know, they at Pret a Manger, Leave voters, you know, eating a pie and mash shop. That's if you were being kind of incredibly crude about it. And I think in some respects what that demonstrates is the fact that there is this kind of schism. But I think often when we talk about there being a kind of culture war element to Brexit, when we talk about the fact that there is a section of British society who is really set against the other, that Leave voters wanted to just kind of, you know, strike a blow against people who hold not just their views but their lifestyles in contempt. I think that was definitely a big part of it. But I think a lot of it is actually a reaction to elite hypocrisy. Because a lot of the so-called culture of the kind of metropolitan, Remain-loving middle classes is actually a bit, you know, is actually rubbish. You know, they talk about being incredibly cosmopolitan, but that they mean, you know, they go on expensive holidays once a year and they have, you know, they talk constantly about, you know, how much they are so pro-immigrant, and yet ultimately, unlike ordinary working class people who have friends from migrant communities who mix with these people, their main engagement with them is they serve them in Pret a Manger or they might work in their house, you know. So there is an element of this which I think does show a bit of a divide, but it's also a hypocrisy. This idea that the people in Islington or in the rich boroughs of London kind of have both, not just in terms of what they think, but in the way they live their lives, a kind of sense of superiority. And I think a lot of what Leave voters respond to that is not the content of those views, that ideas, that lifestyle. It's the fact that they're just, you know, full of nonsense really when they're talking about how much more cosmopolitan, forward-looking and wonderful they are. You know, I think that cultural divide is important, but I think what it really shows is the hypocrisy of a lot of those people really. I think if Brexit is thwarted, or if it's undermined, or if it's diluted to the point of just being, you know, Brexit in name only, I think it would do nothing short than just destroy the idea of democracy in this country for a generation. You know, the thing about the Brexit vote and the referendum campaign was that it energised a lot of people who hadn't voted for, in some cases, 20, 30 years. A lot of people who felt that the political parties were completely divorced from their own concerns and lives. They saw in Brexit an opportunity to kind of bring politics back home, if you like, a little bit closer to what they want and what they think. And if the response from the elite is to say, well, that's nice, but no, you're leaving those people with two options, which is to kind of resign themselves entirely or to, you know, express their views via other means. That's really all that you're allowing people to do. I don't want to be too doom and gloom about this, but at the same time, I think at the very least, it would squander a tremendous opportunity. Because anyone who's kind of followed politics over the last 10, 20 years, there's this constant discussion about, oh, people are so disengaged, you know, how do we bring people back in? How do we make people turn out to vote? How do we give them something worth voting for? Brexit was kind of all of those things. It energised people, it excited people, it gave them something to really believe in politically. And I think at the very moment that is squandered, that is effectively just, you know, kicked to one side, I think that for most people, the whole idea of democracy in this country will just look like a sham. You know, Brexit was the biggest democratic mandate in British political history. If that can't be implemented, then why should people take any election seriously again? In the aftermath of Brexit, there's been this constant attempt to kind of define Brexit down, to say it's something that it isn't, to say that Leave voters, you know, voted Leave, but they didn't want to leave this part of the European Union or this part of the European Union. As well as we've had a Tory party who frankly set out all these red lines, but have now erased them. But I think for myself as a Leave voter, and for the vast majority of Leave voters, I think, the red lines are really, really simple. It is about taking back control. That means leaving the single market, that means leaving the customs union, that means leaving the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. It means leaving all of those European institutions which exist to limit our control over the laws that govern us and over our policies in areas of trade, of immigration, of everything. And I think one thing that Leave voters really need to steel themselves against is this attempt to tell us what we voted for, to tell us that it's actually remained by another name. And I think we need to kind of stay clear that actually, no, it's about taking back control, it's about bringing back sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and that means leaving all of those EU institutions.